I'm Grace Kim, 52, a seamstress who immigrated from South Korea 25 years ago to build a better life for my family. Last month, my 16-year-old daughter Lucy asked me not to attend her graduation because my accent was embarrassing in front of her friends. After decades of sacrifice and silent endurance, her words shattered something inside me. But what I decided to do next would teach her and our entire family a lesson about shame, honor, and the true cost of forgetting where you come from. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever felt judged for who you are or where you come from, like this video for stories of resilience and rediscovering your worth. The silence that followed Lucy's request hung in our kitchen like smoke from burned rice. I stood there, my hands still wet from washing dishes, watching my daughter scroll through her phone as if she hadn't just asked me to disappear from the most important day of her high school career. "Mom, you understand, right?" she said without looking up. "It's not personal. It's just you know how kids are." I did know how kids are. I'd spent 16 years protecting her from exactly this kind of cruelty, the kind that comes from being different, from speaking with an accent that marks you as foreign no matter how many years you've called America home. My naturalization certificate hangs framed in our hallway, next to Lucy's baby pictures and school awards. The edges have faded over the years, but I remember the day I received it like it was yesterday, September 15, 2003. I wore my best dress navy blue with small white flowers, and practiced my oath of allegiance in the mirror that morning until my pronunciation was perfect. I hereby declare, on oath, that I absolutely and entirely renounce and abjure all allegiance and fidelity to any foreign prince, potentate, state, or sovereignty. The words felt heavy in my mouth then, like stones I was swallowing, not because I didn't want to be American, but because saying them felt like erasing who I was before. 20-5 years ago, I stepped off a plane at LAX with 2 suitcases and a heart full of dreams. I was 27, younger than Lucy is now, and I believed that America was a place where hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle. I believed that if I just worked hard enough, learned English well enough, adapted quickly enough, I would belong. Lucy was born 3 years later, a chubby-cheeked baby who spoke her first words in English. Mama and Dada came out in perfect American pronunciation, and I felt a mixture of pride and loss that I couldn't quite name. She would never struggle with language the way I did. She would never feel the frustration of having thoughts in one language and having to translate them into another. She would belong in ways I never could. But standing in my kitchen, watching my daughter dismiss me with such casual cruelty, I realized that belonging had come at a cost neither of us had fully understood. Lucy belonged so completely to this world that she'd forgotten the sacrifices that made her place in it possible. "I understand," I heard myself say, my voice steady despite the trembling in my chest. "I will not come to graduation." Lucy finally looked up from her phone, and for a moment, I saw something flicker across her face, surprise, maybe even regret, but it passed quickly, replaced by relief. "Thanks, Mom. I knew you'd get it." She stood and kissed my cheek, the same perfunctory gesture she'd been giving me for years. "I'm going to study at Sarah's. Don't wait up." After she left, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at that faded certificate on the wall. The oath I'd taken promised that I would support and defend the Constitution and laws of the United States of America. But no one had prepared me for the day I'd need to defend my right to exist in my own daughter's life. That night, I couldn't sleep. I found myself in my sewing room, running my fingers over the worn fabric of my first paycheck stub, tucked between the pages of my old appointment book, $43.67 for a week's worth of work at the garment factory, downtown. I was pregnant with Lucy then, my belly just beginning to show, and I remember thinking that $43 was a fortune. The factory was a windowless building where dozens of women bent over sewing machines, their fingers flying across seams while supervisors barked orders in broken English. The air was thick with cotton dust and the sound of needles punching through fabric. I worked there for 2 years, even after Lucy was born, bringing her with me in a carrier that I'd wedged between my machine and my chair. My station was next to Maria, a woman from El Salvador who'd been in America for 10 years. She taught me how to increase my piece rate, how to fix jams without calling the supervisor, how to pack extra sandwiches because lunch breaks were too short to leave the building. She also taught me my first lesson in American pragmatism. Mia, she said, you speak too good English for this place. You need to learn to speak worse, or they think you're uppity. I didn't understand what she meant until I asked the floor supervisor about the opening for a pattern cutter, a job that paid $3 more per hour. He looked at me like I'd suggested I could fly. Pattern cutting is skilled work, he said. You need education for that. Experience, you understand. I understood. I understood that my engineering degree from Seoul National University meant nothing here. I understood that the English I'd spent years perfecting was somehow still not good enough. I understood that the accent I couldn't quite lose would follow me everywhere, marking me as perpetually foreign. But I also understood something else. Lucy would never know this world. She would never stand in a factory, breathing cotton dust, wondering if her dreams were foolish. She would speak perfect English, earn perfect grades, and have perfect opportunities. That was worth $43 a week. That was worth everything. When Lucy was 3, I left the factory and started taking in sewing work from home. I'd found a small apartment with good light and enough space for my machine. Lucy would play with fabric scraps while I worked, building castles and dragons from the pieces of other people's lives. She called my workspace Mama's magic room because I could take broken things and make them whole again. Those were good years. Lucy was proud of what I did then. She'd bring her friends over to watch me work, explaining with 4-year-old authority how I could make a dress from scratch, how I could take in a waist or let out a hem so perfectly you'd never know it had been altered. My mama can fix anything, she'd announce, and I'd feel my heart swell with pride. I took on more work as my reputation grew. Mrs. Henderson from the church brought me her daughter's wedding dress to restore. Mr. Patel from the corner store asked me to tailor his son's graduation suit. Word spread through the neighborhood that Grace Kim could make any garment fit perfectly, that she was reliable and fair and skilled. Lucy stopped bringing friends to my sewing room. When she started middle school, she'd redirect them to her bedroom, closing the door behind them with a quick "my mom's working" that somehow sounded like an apology. I told myself it was normal, that teenagers were naturally embarrassed by their parents, but I noticed how she'd lower her voice when she mentioned what I did for a living, how she'd quickly change the subject when her friends asked about my work. The irony wasn't lost on me. Every stitch I sewed, every hem I pressed, every alteration I completed was an investment in Lucy's future. The money I earned went toward her school supplies, her clothes, her college fund, but somehow, the work itself had become something to hide, something shameful. I learned to be quiet about my accomplishments. When I finally saved enough to buy my own sewing machine, a professional grade Benina, that cost more than my first care, I didn't celebrate. When I landed my first contract with a local boutique, I didn't share the news over dinner. When my client list grew to include some of the city's most prominent families, I kept that information to myself. The silence became a habit. I swallowed my pride the way I'd swallowed my accent, pushing it down deeper each time Lucy seemed uncomfortable with who I was. I told myself I was protecting her, saving her from the embarrassment of having a mother who worked with her hands, who spoke with an accent, who didn't fit the image of success that her American-born friends took for granted. But lying awake that night, holding that first paycheck stub, I wondered if my silence had taught Lucy the wrong lesson. Maybe I'd been so focused on giving her opportunities that I'd forgotten to teach her about sacrifice. Maybe I'd been so determined to help her belong that I'd made myself disappear. Lucy's honor roll certificate arrived in the mail on a Tuesday, along with a letter from the school district congratulating her on being selected as valedictorian. I held the certificate up to the light, admiring the gold seal and elegant script that proclaimed my daughter's academic excellence. She'd maintained a perfect 4.0 GPA for 4 years, earned a 1520 on her SATs, and secured early admission to Northwestern University. I should have felt nothing but pride. Instead, I felt a strange hollowness, as if I were looking at an achievement that belonged to someone else's daughter. Lucy had always been gifted. Even as a toddler, she'd absorbed languages like a sponge, switching effortlessly between the Korean I spoke at home and the English she learned from television and preschool. By age 5, she was correcting my pronunciation. By age 10, she was helping me write business correspondence, translating my thoughts into perfect American English. "Mom, you can't say more better," she'd tell me, her voice patient but firm. "It's either better or much better, and you need to drop the D before Walmart. It's just Walmart, not the Walmart." I was grateful for her help, proud of her intelligence. But somewhere along the way, our roles had reversed. The child had become the teacher, and I had become the student who couldn't quite keep up. The transformation became more obvious when Lucy entered high school. She joined the debate team, the honor society, the student government. She spoke at school assemblies with confidence and poise that I envied. Teachers loved her, other parents praised her. She was everything I had dreamed she would become: successful, articulate, American. But success had come with a price. Lucy began to distance herself from anything that marked her as different. She stopped wearing the hanbok I'd bought for Korean New Year. She claimed she was too busy to attend cultural events at the Korean Community Center. When her friends asked about her background, she'd say she was half Korean, even though her father had never been in the picture. The half-truth bothered me more than an outright lie would have. It suggested that being fully Korean was something to be ashamed of, something that needed to be diluted to be acceptable. I watched her navigate her American life with a mixture of pride and loss. At parent-teacher conferences, she'd introduce me quickly and then dominate the conversation, explaining her academic goals and extracurricular activities with the kind of fluency I'd never possessed. I became a prop in her performance, present but not really participating. Lucy is such a remarkable young woman, Mrs. Peterson, her English teacher, told me last fall. She has such poise and maturity. You must be very proud. I nodded and smiled, but I wondered if Mrs. Peterson knew that Lucy's poise came from years of managing her mother's limitations, that her maturity was born from the responsibility of being the bridge between two worlds. The honor roll certificate was beautiful, thick paper with embossed lettering and that official gold seal, but as I held it, I realized it represented more than academic achievement. It was a symbol of Lucy's complete integration into American society, her total mastery of a system that had always kept me at arm's length. I placed the certificate on the kitchen counter where Lucy would see it when she came home from school. When she walked in that afternoon, her face lit up with genuine joy for the first time in months. "Mom, did you see? I made valedictorian." She hugged me tightly, and for a moment, I felt like I was embracing the little girl who used to be proud of my magic room. "I am so proud of you," I said, meaning it completely. "You worked so hard for this." "I can't believe it's really happening," she said, pulling back to look at the certificate again. "Northwestern, valedictorian, everything I dreamed of. And, you know what the best part is? I get to give the graduation speech. I get to represent our entire class." The joy in her voice was infectious, and I found myself smiling despite the complicated feelings swirling in my chest. This was what I'd worked for, what all those years of sacrifice had been building toward. "What will you say in your speech?" I asked. Lucy's expression grew thoughtful. "I want to talk about overcoming obstacles, about how America gives everyone a chance to succeed if they're willing to work for it, about how your circumstances don't have to define your future." I nodded, but something in her words made me uneasy. There was an implicit judgment in her philosophy, a suggestion that those who didn't succeed simply hadn't worked hard enough. It was a very American way of thinking, one that didn't account for the invisible barriers that some of us faced. "That sounds wonderful," I said. "I cannot wait to hear it." Lucy beamed at me, and in that moment, I made a decision that would later break my heart. I decided not to complicate her joy with questions about what overcoming obstacles meant to someone who'd never really faced them. I decided not to point out that her success was built on sacrifices she didn't even recognize. I decided to stay silent, the way I always had. But this time, my silence would cost me more than I could have imagined. My English dictionary sits on my nightstand like a faithful companion, its pages soft from years of handling. The margins are filled with my handwriting pronunciation guides, grammar notes, cultural explanations that no textbook ever provided. It's a record of my 25-year struggle to master a language that still feels foreign in my mouth. The dictionary was my first purchase in America, bought from a used bookstore in Koreatown for $12. I carried it everywhere during those early years, pulling it out at grocery stores to understand labels, at parent-teacher conferences to follow conversations, at the DMV to decipher forms. Lucy used to be fascinated by my note-taking, watching me write Korean translations next to English words, creating my own bilingual bridge. "Why do you write so much in your book, Mama?" she'd asked, tracing the Korean characters with her small finger. "Because English is like a puzzle," I'd explain. "Every word has a special place. and I need to remember where it goes. She'd nod solemnly, as if she understood the weight of the task. Sometimes she'd quiz me on new words, clapping her hands when I got the pronunciation right. Good job, Mama, you're getting so much better. But as Lucy grew older, her encouragement turned into corrections, and her corrections eventually became embarrassment. The turning point came when she was 12 and I attended her school's International Day. I'd prepared a presentation about Korean culture, complete with traditional music and a cooking demonstration. I'd practiced my speech for weeks, consulting my dictionary for proper pronunciation. Everything was going well until I tried to explain the concept of jeng, the deep emotional connection that binds Korean families together. In English, there's no direct translation. I fumbled through the explanation, mixing up my verb tenses, dropping articles, my accent growing thicker with nervousness. Jeng is like, how do you say, the feeling of heart that connects people, like invisible string that ties family together, even when they are far apart or have different thinking. The other parents smiled politely, but I could see the confusion in their eyes. After the presentation, Lucy was quiet on the drive home. Finally, she spoke up. Mom, you said different thinking when you meant different opinions, and it's an invisible string. Not invisible string. I knew she was trying to help, but her words stung. I worked very hard on that speech, I said quietly. I know you did. It's just sometimes when you speak English, it's hard for people to understand what you mean. That night, I stared at my dictionary until the words blurred together. 25 years in America, and I was still making mistakes that marked me as foreign. 25 years of studying, practicing, immersing myself in English. And my daughter was still embarrassed by the way I spoke. The cruel irony was that Lucy had learned her perfect English from me. During her early years, I'd read to her every night, sounding out words carefully, making sure she heard proper pronunciation. I'd enrolled her in the best schools, hired tutors when she struggled with reading, bought her books and educational games. Every dollar I spent on her language development was a dollar I didn't spend on improving my own. My English was functional, good enough for business, clear enough for daily life, but it wasn't elegant, it wasn't effortless. It carried the weight of my Korean childhood, the rhythm of my first language, the grammatical structures that had been carved into my mind before I ever heard an English word. Lucy's English, by contrast, was fluid and natural. She could make jokes that relied on wordplay I didn't understand. She could write essays that flowed like poetry. She could speak in public without worrying about her accent or her grammar. She possessed the linguistic confidence that I'd sacrificed my own potential to give her. The dictionary became a symbol of that sacrifice. Every definition I'd looked up, every pronunciation I'd practiced, every grammar rule I'd memorized was an investment in her future. But somehow, my efforts had become a source of shame rather than pride. I started avoiding situations where I'd have to speak English in front of Lucy's friends. I'd smile and nod at school events, letting her do the talking. I'd send her to parent-teacher conferences alone, trusting her to advocate for herself. I'd decline invitations to social gatherings where my accent might embarrass her. The silence that had once been protective became a prison. I was disappearing from my own daughter's life, one avoided conversation at a time, but that worn dictionary on my nightstand told a different story. It was evidence of my determination, my refusal to give up, my daily commitment to bridging two worlds. Every margin note was a small victory, every dog-eared page a testament to my perseverance. Lucy never saw it that way. To her, my dictionary was just another reminder of my limitations, another sign that I didn't quite belong in her perfectly American world. She couldn't see that every word I'd learned was a love letter to her future. Every pronunciation I'd practiced was a prayer for her success. The language I'd struggled to master had become the language of our disconnect. But maybe it was time to use my imperfect English to say the perfect truth, that love doesn't require perfect grammar, and that belonging doesn't depend on the absence of an accent. Maybe it was time to stop apologizing for the sound of my voice and start using it to tell the story. Lucy had never heard the story of what it cost to give her the gift of effortless American English. The graduation speech draft was spread across Lucy's desk when I brought her afternoon snack, sliced pears and green tea, the same combination I'd been serving her since she was 5. She was hunched over her laptop, typing furiously, completely absorbed in her work. "How is the speech coming?" I asked, setting the plate beside her notebook. Lucy looked up, her eyes bright with excitement. "It's going really well. I think I've found the perfect theme. Listen to this opening. 4 years ago, we walked into Lincoln High as children. Today, we leave as adults, ready to shape the future of America. I nodded appreciatively. That sounds very powerful, right? And then I go into this whole section about how our generation doesn't see obstacles, we see opportunities, how we've learned to overcome any challenge through hard work and determination. She scrolled through her document, pointing to different paragraphs. I talk about how some of us came from difficult circumstances, but we refused to let that define us. As she continued reading excerpts, I noticed something that made my chest tighten. The speech was beautifully written, eloquent and inspiring, but it was also strangely impersonal. She mentioned teachers who had influenced her, friends who had supported her, even the custodian who had encouraged her during late-night study sessions, but there was no mention of family, no acknowledgement of the sacrifices that had made her success possible. It sounds wonderful, I said carefully. Will you mention your family in the speech? Lucy paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Well, it's not really that kind of speech. It's more about the class as a whole, you know, about our collective journey. Of course, I said, but the words felt hollow. I am sure everyone will love it. Lucy beamed and returned to her typing. I stood there for a moment, watching her fingers fly across the keys with the same precision I used when sewing a delicate seam. She was so confident, so sure of her place in the world. When had she become this person who could speak for an entire graduating class? When had she become someone who saw her family as irrelevant to her story of success? Mom, she said suddenly, not looking up from her screen, I've been thinking about graduation. You know how crowded these things get, and parking is always a nightmare. My heart began to race, though I wasn't sure why. Yes, well, since you'll probably be working that day anyway, you mentioned Mrs. Chen needs her dress finished maybe. It would be easier if you just watched the live stream from home. That way, you won't have to deal with all the hassle. The words hit me like a physical blow. I set down the empty tray carefully, my hands trembling slightly. You do not want me to come to your graduation. Lucy finally looked at me, and I saw something flicker across her face. Guilt, maybe, or annoyance at having to explain herself. It's not that I don't want you there, it's just practical. You hate crowds, and you always complain about how long these ceremonies are. Plus, your English gets worse when you're nervous, and I know you get anxious speaking to other parents. Each reason felt like a small knife. She wasn't wrong. I did get nervous in crowds. I did struggle with small talk at school events. But the way she presented these facts made them sound like character flaws rather than understandable anxieties. I see, I said quietly. And honestly, Mom, some of my friends' parents can be kind of judgmental. You know how they are about, she gestured vaguely, as if my entire identity could be dismissed with a wave of her hand. I just don't want you to feel uncomfortable. The kindness in her voice made it worse. She genuinely believed she was protecting me from embarrassment, saving me from a situation where my accent, my profession, my foreignness might make her friends' parents look down on me. What she couldn't see was that I'd been dealing with judgmental people for 25 years. I'd learned to hold my head high in rooms where I was the only immigrant, the only person with an accent, the only one whose success was measured in alterations rather than annual salaries. I'd developed a thick skin and a quiet dignity that had served me well. But none of that mattered if my own daughter saw me as a liability. If that is what you think is best, I heard myself say. The words came out steady.com. Even understanding. I had perfected this tone over the years, the voice of a mother who puts her child's comfort above her own pain. Lucy's relief was immediate and obvious. Thanks, Mom. I knew you'd understand. This way you can watch the whole thing on your computer, and you'll probably get a better view anyway. She turned back to her speech, already moving on from the conversation that had just broken my heart. I picked up the tray and walked toward the door, pausing when she called after me. Oh, and Mom, Mrs. Chen called earlier. She wants to add beading to her dress. I told her you'd call back. Of course, I said. I will take care of it. As I closed her bedroom door behind me, I realized that Lucy had just perfectly summarized how she saw our relationship. I was the person who took care of things, who handled the details, who managed the inconvenient parts of life so she could focus on more important matters. I was useful when she needed help with homework or business correspondence. but invisible when it came to celebrating her achievements. The graduation speech draft on her desk told the story of a remarkable young woman who had succeeded through her own determination and hard work. It was an inspiring narrative, the kind of American dream story that people loved to hear. It was also completely false. That evening, I found myself standing in the hallway, staring at the family photo from Lucy's 10th birthday. It was taken at the Korean Cultural Center during their annual festival, and Lucy is wearing the hanbok I'd sewn for her, bright pink silk with delicate embroidered flowers. Her face is radiant with joy, her arms wrapped around my waist as we pose in front of a traditional Korean pavilion. I remember that day clearly because it was one of the last times Lucy seemed genuinely proud of our heritage. She'd insisted on wearing the hanbok to school the Monday after the festival, excited to share photos with her classmates during their weekly culture presentations. She'd practiced her speech about Korean traditions for hours, asking me to teach her the proper pronunciation of Korean words. "Mom, tell me again about Chuseok," she'd said, sitting cross-legged on my bedroom floor, while I hemmed the hanbok. "I want to make sure I explain it right." I'd told her about the harvest festival, about families gathering to honor their ancestors, about the mooncakes and traditional games. She'd listened with the intensity of a scholar, taking notes in her careful handwriting. "We should make song this year," she'd declared. "I want to learn how to make the rice cakes like Halabayoji taught you." My father had taught me to make those delicate half-moon-shaped treats when I was Lucy's age, his weathered hands guiding mine as we shaped the rice dough around sweet fillings. He'd told me stories while we cooked tales of his childhood in rural Korea, of the Japanese occupation, of the dreams that sustained him through decades of hardship. "Cooking is memory," he'd said. "Every dish carries the story of our people." I'd tried to pass those stories to Lucy, to help her understand that she was part of something larger than herself. For a while, she'd been eager to learn. She'd help me prepare traditional foods for Korean holidays, practice writing her name in Hangul, listen to K-pop with genuine interest rather than teenage obligation. But somewhere around middle school, that enthusiasm began to fade. The hanbok stayed in her closet. The Korean language lessons were abandoned in favor of SAT prep. The stories about her grandfather were dismissed as old-fashioned, tales that had no relevance to her American life. Looking at that photograph now, I could see the exact moment when our worlds began to diverge. Lucy was still my daughter in the picture, still proud to be Korean American. But even then, I could see the seeds of the distance that would eventually grow between us. The girl in the photo had dreams that included her heritage. She wanted to visit Seoul someday, to meet her extended family, to understand the country that had shaped her mother. She talked about becoming a translator, using her bilingual abilities to help other immigrant families. "I want to be like you, Mom," she'd said that day. "I want to help people." 16-year-old Lucy had very different dreams. She wanted to study international business, to work for a multinational corporation, to travel the world as an American executive. Her Korean heritage wasn't part of that vision. It was something to be managed, minimized, overcome. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It was a gradual erosion, like water wearing away stone. Each time she corrected my English, each time she chose not to attend Korean cultural events, each time she introduced herself as half Korean instead of claiming her full identity, she moved a little further away from the girl in the photograph. I'd enabled the distance, I realized, in my eagerness to help her assimilate, to ensure her success in American society. I'd stopped insisting that she maintain connections to her roots. When she said she was too busy for Korean school, I'd accepted it. When she stopped wearing traditional clothes, I'd said nothing. When she began to act embarrassed by my accent, I'd started speaking less around her friends. I'd thought I was giving her freedom to choose her own path, but maybe I'd actually been teaching her that being Korean was optional, something that could be discarded when it became inconvenient. The photo showed a mother and daughter who belonged to each other completely. We were both wearing hanboks, both smiling with the same shaped eyes, both proud of who we were. Lucy's hand rested on the fabric of her skirt, her fingers tracing the embroidered flowers. I'd sewn with such care. Now she couldn't bear the thought of me attending her graduation, couldn't risk having her friends see the Korean woman who'd raised her. The girl who had once begged me to teach her traditional recipes now found my very presence embarrassing. I touched the glass covering the photograph, my fingertip resting on Lucy's younger face. That little girl was still in there somewhere. buried under years of assimilation and academic pressure and social anxiety. The question was whether I had the courage to fight for her, to demand that my daughter remember who she was before she became who she thought she needed to be. The woman in the photograph was younger too, more hopeful, still believing that love and sacrifice would be enough to bridge any gap. She thought that if she just worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, accommodated enough, her daughter would always need her. But maybe that woman had been wrong. Maybe love without boundaries was just another form of disappearing. Maybe it was time to stop accommodating and start insisting on my right to exist in my daughter's life accent, profession, heritage, and all. I spent the weekend going through old letters, documents I hadn't touched in years. They were stored in a wooden box my father had made for me before I left Korea, farewell gift that I'd carried across an ocean and 25 years of American life. The wood still smelled faintly of the workshop where he'd crafted it, his careful hands shaping each joint and corner. The letters were written on thin paper that crinkled like autumn leaves. My mother's handwriting, delicate and precise, filled page after page with news from home, advice for raising Lucy, gentle questions about my life in America. Reading them now, I was struck by how much love and worry were contained in each carefully chosen word. Gyamsana, my mother had written in one letter from 1999, using my Korean name with the tender suffix reserved for beloved daughters. I dreamed about Lucy last night. She was speaking Korean and teaching me English words. Even in my dreams, she is building bridges between our worlds. My mother had died 5 years ago, never having met Lucy in person. The travel was too expensive, the distance too great, the bureaucracy too complicated, but she'd followed every detail of her granddaughter's life through my letters and the occasional blurry photo I'd managed to email. Tell Lucy that her Harmony is proud of her good grades, she'd written in 2010, but remind her that intelligence without kindness is like a flower without fragrance, beautiful but incomplete. I'd never shared that particular piece of wisdom with Lucy. I'd been so focused on her academic success, so worried about her fitting in, that I'd forgotten to emphasize the values my mother had tried to pass down through me. Kindness, respect for elders, the importance of family bonds. These things had seemed less urgent than test scores and college applications. Another letter, dated just 6 months before my mother's death, contained a question that now felt prophetic. Does Lucy remember her Korean family? Does she know the stories of her ancestors? I worry that in becoming American, she might forget where her strength comes from. I'd assured my mother that Lucy knew her heritage, that we celebrated Korean holidays and maintained our cultural traditions. But even as I'd written those reassurances, I'd known they were becoming less true with each passing year. The most painful letter was one I'd never sent. I'd written it after my mother's funeral, pouring out my grief and guilt and fear onto paper. In it, I'd confessed that Lucy had refused to come to Korea for the service, claiming she couldn't miss school during her junior year. I'd made excuses for her, told my family she was too young to understand, promised she'd visit when she was older, but the truth was simpler and more devastating. Lucy hadn't seen the point in mourning a grandmother she'd never met, in participating in rituals she didn't understand, in acknowledging connections she'd already begun to sever. I failed to keep my promise to you, Iyama. I'd written in that unsent letter. I gave Lucy every opportunity, every advantage, every chance for success, but I forgot to give her roots. I forgot to teach her that she comes from a long line of strong women who faced hardship with dignity and grace. Mixed in with my mother's letters were documents that told the story of my own journey. Visa applications, employment records, tax returns that showed my gradual financial progress. Looking at them now, I was amazed by how much I'd accomplished. I'd arrived with nothing and built a successful business. I'd raised a brilliant daughter as a single mother. I'd learned a new language, adapted to a new culture, created a life that would have been unimaginable to the frightened young woman who'd stepped off that plane in 1998. But the documents also revealed something Lucy had never known, the extent of the sacrifices that had made her comfortable life possible. Bank statements showing how I'd worked 3 jobs during her early years, loan applications for money to pay her private school tuition, medical bills I'd ignored to save money for her college fund. One document stood out among the rest, a letter from Northwestern University's financial aid office dated just 2 months ago. It detailed the parent contribution expected for Lucy's freshman year, $47,000. I'd been quietly working extra hours, taking on additional clients, preparing to cover costs that Lucy assumed would somehow magically be handled. She'd never asked how we'd pay for her education. She'd never wondered how a seamstress could afford to send her daughter to one of the country's most expensive universities. She'd simply assumed that the money would be there, the way it always had been for everything else she'd needed. The irony was bitter. Lucy was embarrassed by my profession, ashamed of my accent, uncomfortable with my presence at her graduation, but everything she was proud of, her education, her opportunities, her bright future, had been purchased with the profits from that embarrassing work, saved by the woman with the shameful accent. I found one more document at the bottom of the box: Lucy's birth certificate, born at 3:17 a.m. on March 15, 2007, weighing 6 pounds and 4 ounces. I remembered that night with perfect clarity: the long labor, the fear of giving birth alone, in a country where I still felt like a stranger, the overwhelming love I'd felt when they placed her in my arms. I'd whispered to her in Korean that first night, making promises I'd intended to keep forever. I'd told her about her grandparents, about the mountain village where her great-grandfather had raised sheep, about the legends and songs and stories that were her birthright. I'd promised to teach her everything I knew about where she came from, to help her understand that she was part of something ancient and beautiful and strong. Looking at that birth certificate now, I realized that Lucy's rejection of me was also a rejection of those promises, those stories, that inheritance I'd tried so hard to preserve for her. She didn't want to be part of something ancient and beautiful and strong, if it meant being different, if it meant carrying an accent, if it meant having a mother who worked with her hands instead of her mind. But maybe it was time to remind her that she didn't get to choose her history. She could reject her heritage, dismiss her family, minimize her origins, but she couldn't erase the truth of where her opportunities had come from, or the price that had been paid for her American dream. My sewing machine manual was dog-eared and stained with years of use. The cover held together with careful strips of clear tape. I'd bought the Benina 15 years ago, saving for months to afford the professional-grade equipment that would allow me to take on more complex alterations. The manual had been my Bible, teaching me techniques that elevated my work from basic hemming to intricate couture alterations. Sitting in my workshop that Sunday morning, surrounded by half-finished projects and bolts of fabric, I found myself thinking about expertise, about the years of study and practice required to master any craft. Lucy respected intellectual achievement, honored academic credentials, admired professional success, but she'd never understood that my work required its own form of mastery, its own dedication to excellence. The manual contained sections on advanced techniques I'd spent years perfecting: French seams that were invisible from both sides, buttonholes that required mathematical precision, pattern adjustments that demanded an understanding of geometry and human anatomy. Each skill had taken months to learn, years to master. Yet, in Lucy's mind, I was just a seamstress, as if the word "just" could diminish decades of professional development. I'd been enabling her dismissive attitude through my own silence. Every time she'd introduced me with apologetic brevity, every time she'd redirected conversations away from my work, every time she'd minimized my contributions to our family's success, I'd said nothing. I'd told myself I was being gracious, avoiding conflict, putting her comfort first. But my silence had taught her the wrong lesson. Instead of learning humility and gratitude, she'd learned to take my sacrifices for granted. Instead of understanding the value of honest work, she'd absorbed the message that some professions were inherently less worthy than others. Instead of respecting the woman who'd raised her, she'd learned to be ashamed of her. The plan that began forming in my mind wasn't about revenge, it was about education. Lucy needed to understand the real story of her life, the true cost of her opportunities, the actual source of her advantages. She needed to learn that dignity doesn't depend on the type of work you do, but on how well you do it. I started by gathering evidence of my professional reputation, client testimonials that praised not just my technical skills but my creativity and problem-solving abilities, photos of my work wedding dresses I'd restored, suits I'd tailored, formal gowns I'd created from scratch, invoices that showed the premium prices my services commanded, the trust that high-end boutiques placed in my expertise. Mrs. Harrison's letter was particularly eloquent. Grace Kim saved my daughter's wedding by completely reconstructing a dress that had been damaged in shipping. Her attention to detail, her artistic eye, and her ability to work under pressure were extraordinary. She didn't just fix a dress, she created a miracle. Senator Williams' wife had written something similar after I'd altered her inauguration. Outfit: Ms. Kim's work is impeccable. She has the rare combination of technical precision and artistic vision that elevates her craft to the level of art. These weren't the words used to describe just a seamstress. These were testimonials to a master craftswoman, an artist whose expertise was valued by people who could afford to be discerning. The second part of my plan involved financial documentation. Lucy had never seen our tax returns, never understood the scope of my business income, never realized that her embarrassing mother earned more than many of her friends' parents. The numbers told a story of gradual growth and increasing success, of a business built through reputation and word-of-mouth referrals. More importantly, the documents showed where the money had gone: Lucy's private school tuition, her SAT prep courses, her summer enrichment programs, her college fund. Every dollar I'd earned had been invested in her future, in the opportunities that had made her success possible. The third element was more personal: the documentation of choices I'd made that Lucy had never known about. The job offer I'd declined because it would have required travel that conflicted with her school schedule. The clients I'd turned away because their deadlines would have interfered with her activities. The evening classes I'd skipped to help her with homework. The professional development opportunities I'd sacrificed to be available when she needed me. But the most important part of my plan wasn't about documentation or evidence. It was about conversation. Lucy and I needed to have a discussion we'd been avoiding for years. One that would require me to step out of my comfortable silence and speak difficult truths. I wouldn't ambush her or embarrass her in front of her friends. I wouldn't make demands or issue ultimatums, but I would no longer allow her to dismiss me, minimize my contributions, or take my love for granted. I would insist on being seen as the complex, accomplished, dignified woman I actually was, not the simplified caricature she'd created in her mind. The sewing machine manual reminded me that every technique had to be practiced repeatedly before it became natural. Learning to set boundaries with my daughter would require the same kind of patience and persistence. I'd applied to mastering French seams and invisible zippers, but I'd spent 25 years learning to adapt to American culture, mastering a foreign language, building a business from nothing. Teaching my daughter to respect her mother couldn't be more difficult than any of those challenges. The manual's introduction contained a line I'd always found inspiring: precision and artistry are not opposing forces, they complement each other to create work of lasting beauty and value. It was time to apply that philosophy to my relationship with Lucy, to demonstrate that dignity and love, honesty and kindness could work together to create something more beautiful than the silence I'd maintained for too long. I discovered the truth by accident. Lucy had left her laptop open on the kitchen counter while she took a shower, and I was simply moving it aside to make space for dinner preparations when I saw the document on her screen. It was her college application essay for Northwestern, the one she'd worked on for months, the one she'd never let me read despite my offers to help with proofreading. The title made my breath catch: Overcoming Obstacles, How I Learned to Rise Above My Circumstances. I knew I shouldn't read it. I knew it was an invasion of her privacy, but something compelled me to scroll through the document, to finally see how my daughter had chosen to tell her story to the admissions committee. The essay began beautifully, with vivid descriptions of her academic achievements and extracurricular activities. Her writing was sophisticated, her voice confident and compelling, but as I continued reading, I felt my heart sinking with each paragraph. Growing up in a single-parent household presented unique challenges, she'd written. My mother, an immigrant with limited English skills and minimal education, worked as a seamstress to support our family. While I'm grateful for her sacrifices, I recognized early that I would need to be self-reliant if I wanted to succeed academically. The clinical tone of the description stung, but what followed was worse. Lucy had crafted a narrative in which she was the hero of her own story, a brilliant, determined young woman who had succeeded despite her disadvantages, rather than because of the advantages I'd provided. I taught myself advanced mathematics using library books. Because my mother couldn't help with homework beyond elementary level, I sought out mentorship from teachers and counselors because there was no intellectual guidance available at home. I worked part-time jobs to pay for test prep materials and college application fees because our family's limited resources were stretched thin. Each sentence was technically true but fundamentally misleading. Yes, I couldn't help with calculus homework, but I'd hired tutors when she needed them. Yes, she'd sought guidance from teachers, but I'd initiated those relationships, attending conferences and building connections. Yes, she'd worked part-time but only during her senior year, for spending money, while I covered all her essential expenses. The essay painted a picture of neglect where there had been nurturing, of poverty where there had been careful financial planning, of educational abandonment where there had been constant advocacy. She'd turned my humility about my English skills into a narrative of intellectual deprivation, my immigrant background into a burden she'd heroically overcome. Despite the language barriers at home, I found my voice through academic excellence, she'd continued. I refused to let my circumstances limit my potential, working twice as hard as my peers to achieve the same results. The phrase language barriers at home particularly hurt. Yes, we sometimes mixed Korean and English in our conversations. Yes, I occasionally asked her to help me find the perfect word in English. But those moments had never been barriers, they'd been bridges, opportunities for us to teach each other, to share the unique experience of being bilingual in America. The most devastating paragraph came near the end. My mother's work as a seamstress taught me the value of manual labor. But it also inspired me to pursue intellectual challenges that would allow me to use my mind rather than just my hands. I want to honor her sacrifices by achieving the kind of success that was beyond her reach. Beyond my reach, as if my dreams had been small, my aspirations limited, my intelligence insufficient for anything more than stitching fabric, as if the business I'd built, the reputation I'd earned, the expertise I'd developed, were somehow lesser achievements than the academic success I'd made possible for her. I scrolled back through the essay, looking for any mention of pride in her heritage, any acknowledgement of the strength it had taken for me to rebuild my life in a foreign country, any recognition that her opportunities had been purchased with years of careful sacrifice. There was nothing. In Lucy's version of our story, I was a well-meaning but limited figure, someone to be grateful for but not proud of, someone whose circumstances she'd needed to transcend rather than someone whose example she'd chosen to follow. The immigration documents tucked in my file cabinet told a very different story. They documented a young woman who'd arrived in America with an engineering degree from one of Korea's most prestigious universities, who'd spoken 3 languages fluently, who'd possessed professional qualifications that simply weren't recognized in her new country. They showed someone who'd chosen to rebuild her career from scratch rather than return to Korea, who'd sacrificed her own professional ambitions for her daughter's future. But Lucy had never seen those documents. She'd never asked about my education in Korea, never wondered what dreams I'd given up to provide for her. In her mind, I was someone who'd always been a seamstress, someone whose aspirations had always been modest, someone whose greatest achievement was raising a daughter who could surpass her. The essay ended with a promise. At Northwestern, I planned to study international business, using my unique perspective as a first-generation American to build bridges between cultures while honoring the sacrifices of those who came before me, honoring the sacrifices of those who came before her. The phrase was beautifully written and completely hollow. How could she honor sacrifices she'd never bothered to understand? How could she build bridges between cultures when she'd spent years trying to distance herself from one of them? I closed the laptop carefully and walked to my sewing room, my mind reeling from what I'd read. For months, I'd been proud of Lucy's acceptance to Northwestern, excited about her bright future, confident that all my sacrifices had been worthwhile. But her essay revealed that she saw my sacrifices as burdens rather than gifts, my love as limitation rather than liberation. The girl who'd written that essay wasn't just embarrassed by her mother's accent. She was fundamentally ashamed of where she'd come from, determined to create a narrative in which her success was entirely self-made. It was time for Lucy to learn the real story of her life, starting with the truth about the woman who'd made it all possible. I waited until after dinner to bring up the essay. Lucy was in her room, supposedly studying for her final exams, but I could hear the soft ping of text messages through her closed door. I knocked gently and entered when she called out, "Lucy, we need to talk." She looked up from her phone, immediately wary. In 16 years of motherhood, I'd rarely used that tone. Serious, measured, final. "Is everything okay?" I sat down on the edge of her bed, the same spot where I'd read her bedtime stories for years, where we'd talked through her childhood fears and adolescent anxieties. But this conversation would be different from any we'd ever had. "I saw your college essay today," I said quietly. Her face went white, then flushed red. You went through my computer. Mom, that's a complete invasion of privacy. Your laptop was open. I was moving it to set the table. I should not have read it, but I did. I kept my voice calm, steady. We need to discuss what you wrote. Lucy's defensive anger was immediate and fierce. That essay is personal. It's my story, told from my perspective. You have no right to judge how I choose to share my experiences. Your experiences, I repeated slowly. Tell me, Lucy, what experiences of poverty are you writing about? What intellectual deprivation? What language barriers that prevented your success? She looked away, unable to meet my eyes. You wouldn't understand. It's not about specific about the overall context of growing up in our situation. Our situation. The phrase hung in the air between us. What situation is that, exactly? Mom, please don't make this into a big thing. The essay worked. I got into Northwestern. It's not like I lied about anything. You wrote that my work taught you to value intellectual achievement over manual labor. You wrote that you had to overcome circumstances that were beyond my reach. My voice remained level, but I could feel something hard and cold forming in my chest. You wrote that you received no intellectual guidance at home. Lucy's jaw tightened. That's not. I didn't mean it as an insult. I was just being honest about our different capabilities. Different capabilities. I stood up slowly, walked to her bookshelf, and pulled out her sat prep book, the one I'd bought for her, the one filled with notes in my handwriting from the hours I'd spent helping her practice math problems I'd had to relearn myself. Different capabilities, I repeated, flipping through pages covered with my corrections, my explanations, my encouragement written in the margins. Is this what you call no intellectual guidance? Lucy glanced at the book, then away. That's different. You were just helping with basic stuff. Basic stuff. I set the book down and moved to her desk, where her acceptance letter from Northwestern lay in its place of honor. Do you know how much this education will cost, Lucy? Financial aid will cover most of it. Financial aid will cover 30%. I will pay the rest. $47,000 per year for 4 years. Where do you think that money comes from? For the first time, Lucy looked genuinely surprised. I thought the FAFSA said that FAFSA shows family income. My income, from my work as a seamstress. The work that you described as teaching you to aspire to something better. I could see her mind working, trying to reconcile the narrative she'd created with the reality she'd never bothered to investigate. I didn't know it was that much. I assumed, you assumed. I pulled out my phone and opened the banking app, showing her the college savings account I'd been building for 10 years. You assumed because you never asked. You never wondered how a woman with limited education and minimal English skills could afford to send her daughter to one of the most expensive universities in the country. Lucy stared at the screen, her face pale. Mom, I never meant to. You never meant to what? Understand where your opportunities came from. Acknowledge the sacrifices that made them possible. Respect the woman who provided them. The anger I'd been suppressing for months finally broke through my careful composure. You wrote that you taught yourself mathematics from library books. Do you remember who drove you to that library every day after school? Who sat with you while you studied? Who contacted your teachers when you struggled with calculus and arranged for tutoring that cost me $300 a week? Lucy's eyes filled with tears, but I couldn't stop. The words I'd been swallowing for years poured out like water from a broken dam. You wrote that you sought mentorship because there was no guidance at home. Do you remember who attended every parent-teacher conference, who built relationships with your counselors, who advocated for you when you wanted to skip a grade, when you needed accommodations for your anxiety, when you applied for honors classes? I remember, she whispered. You wrote that language barriers at home inspired you to find your voice, as if the fact that I sometimes speak Korean, the fact that I have an accent, somehow diminished your ability to communicate, as if being bilingual was a limitation rather than a gift. I moved closer to her, my voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Tell me, Lucy, what exactly did you overcome? What obstacles did you face that were not smoothed away by my work, my planning, my sacrifice? She was crying openly now, but I felt no satisfaction in her tears. Only a deep sadness that it had taken this confrontation to make her see what had been in front of her all along. I worked 3 jobs when you were little so you could attend private school. I turned down clients so I could drive you to activities. I learned to navigate American systems I didn't understand so you would never feel lost or confused. I built a business that would provide for your future while making sure you never felt the insecurity I experienced as a new immigrant. I sat back down on the bed, suddenly exhausted. You want to honor the sacrifices of those who came before you. Start by understanding what those sacrifices actually were. The next morning, I placed my business license on the kitchen table next to Lucy's cereal bowl. The document was professionally framed, the gold embossed seal catching the morning light. Grace Kim Couture Alterations. It read, Licensed Business Entity, State of California. Lucy stared at it while she ate, saying nothing. The silence between us was different from our usual comfortable quiet. It was heavy with unspoken questions and uncomfortable truths. I have something to show you, I said finally, sitting down across from her with my coffee. She looked up warily. After our confrontation the night before, she seemed unsure of her footing, as if the familiar terrain of our relationship had shifted beneath her feet. I pulled out a folder I'd prepared, copies of documents I'd gathered over the weekend, evidence of a life Lucy had never bothered to learn about. This is my original business plan from 2005, I said, sliding the first document across the table. I wrote it when you were 8 years old. Lucy picked up the papers, reluctantly, scanning the pages with growing surprise. The plan was detailed and professional, outlining market analysis, financial projections, and growth strategies. It wasn't the simple arrangement she'd imagined a woman taking in sewing from neighbors. It was a comprehensive blueprint for building a business. I studied American business practices for 2 years before I wrote this, I continued. I took night classes at the community college while you were sleeping. Researched competitors, analyzed pricing structures, developed marketing strategies. I learned accounting, business law, tax regulations. Lucy's eyes widened as she read, You projected revenues of $200,000 by year 5. I exceeded that projection by year 4. I pulled out tax returns, pointing to the income figures that showed the steady growth of my business. Last year, Grace Kim Couture Alterations grossed $340,000. The number hung in the air between us. Lucy set down the papers, staring at me with something approaching amazement. I had no idea, because you never asked. I kept my voice gentle but firm. You assumed that because I work with my hands, because I have an accent, because I didn't pursue traditional American career paths, my work was somehow less valuable, less complex, less worthy of respect. I reached into the folder again, pulling out a client portfolio I'd assembled. Mrs. Harrison's daughter's wedding dress, the one that was destroyed in shipping 2 days before the ceremony. The original designer said it couldn't be repaired. I rebuilt it entirely in 36 hours. Lucy looked at the before and after photos, her expression growing more complex with each image. It's beautiful. It looks like it was always perfect. Senator Williams' wife needed alterations for 3 formal events in 1 week. Each outfit required different technique, structural changes to a vintage Chanel suit, resizing a beaded evening gown without disturbing the pattern, creating a custom jacket to match an existing skirt. I showed her the photos of each completed piece. She calls me her fashion miracle worker. Mom, these are incredible. This is art. I felt a flutter of hope at the genuine admiration in her voice. It is art. It's also business, mathematics, psychology, problem solving. Every alteration requires me to understand body geometry, fabric behavior, structural engineering. Every client interaction demands diplomacy, time management, aesthetic judgment. Lucy was quiet for a long moment, studying the portfolio. Why didn't you ever tell me about this? I tried to, many times, but you weren't interested. When I mentioned clients or showed you my work, you'd change the subject, or give polite responses that made it clear you thought my job was just. How did you put it in your essay? Manual labor. I pulled out one more document, my original, college transcripts from Seoul National University, translated into English. You wrote that I had minimal education. I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in textile engineering. I was in the top 5% of my class. Lucy stared at the transcripts, her face cycling through confusion, surprise, and something that might have been shame. You have an engineering degree. Textile engineering. I specialized in fabric technology and garment construction. In Korea, I worked for a company that developed technical fabrics for athletic wear. I understood the molecular structure of synthetic fibers, the physics of stretch and recovery, the chemistry of dyes and treatments. But then why Why did I become a seamstress instead of pursuing engineering here? I smiled sadly. Because American companies didn't recognize my degree. Because starting over in a technical field would have required years of additional education and certification. Because I was pregnant with you and needed to earn money immediately. I leaned forward, wanting her to understand this crucial point. I didn't fail to become an engineer, Lucy. I chose to use my engineering knowledge in a different way. Every alteration I do is applied engineering. Every pattern I modify is technical problem solving. Every client challenge I solve requires the same analytical thinking I used in my corporate job. Lucy was quiet for a long time, processing information that fundamentally challenged her understanding of our family's story. Finally, she spoke in a small voice. I'm sorry. I didn't know. You didn't know because you didn't ask. And I didn't insist on telling you because I thought protecting your feelings was more important than protecting my dignity. I gathered the documents back into the folder. But dignity isn't something I can afford to sacrifice anymore. That afternoon, I spread my financial records across the dining room table like pieces of a puzzle Lucy had never seen assembled. Bank statements, investment portfolios, business expense reports, the paper trail of 16 years of careful financial planning that had made her comfortable life possible. Lucy sat across from me, her usual confidence replaced by a nervous uncertainty. The morning's revelations about my education and business success had shaken her assumptions, but what I was about to show her would complete the picture she'd never bothered to examine. This is your college fund, I said, pointing to an account statement that showed a balance of $247,000. I started it when you were 2 years old with a $100 deposit. Every month since then, I've added money to it. Lucy's eyes widened as she scanned the monthly deposits. Some of these are huge. $800, $1,000 during busy seasons, when I work 16-hour days to complete rush orders, when I take on projects that require me to work through weekends and holidays. I pulled out a calendar from 2 years ago, marked with colored dots. Red dots are 14-hour days. Blue dots are all-nighters. Yellow dots are days I worked instead of attending your school events. She stared at the calendar, counting the colored dots. There are so many. The month you went on that choir trip to Europe. I worked every single day that month to earn the $1,500 for your expenses. The summer you attended Northwestern's pre-college program. I took on 3 wedding parties and worked 18-hour days for 6 weeks straight. I showed her the invoices for each of these periods. The careful calculations that had turned extra work into extraordinary opportunities for her. You never asked how we could afford these things. You just assumed they would happen. Lucy's voice was small. I thought maybe we had savings, or we did have savings. I created them by working extra hours, accepting difficult projects, saying yes to jobs that other seamstresses turned down because they required too much skill or too tight deadlines. I pulled out a folder of particularly challenging projects. Mrs. Chun's daughter's Quinceañera dress, 5 layers of silk with hand-sewn beadwork. I worked on it for 3 weeks, 12 hours a day. The payment funded your SAT prep course. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Every advantage Lucy had enjoyed, every opportunity she'd seized, every comfort she'd taken for granted had been purchased with specific work, planned sacrifices, careful financial management. This is your private school tuition history, I continued, showing her receipts dating back to kindergarten, $18,000 per year. I never missed a payment, never took advantage of payment plans, never allowed your education to be disrupted by financial stress. Lucy was quiet, studying the numbers with the analytical mind I'd spent years nurturing. How did you manage all this? The house payment, your business expenses, my school, my activities, by working harder than anyone else, by building a reputation that allowed me to charge premium prices, by making choices you never knew I was making. I pulled out a different folder, records of opportunities I'd declined, job offers from fashion houses that would have required travel, contracts with department stores that would have meant regular hours away from home, teaching positions at design schools that would have provided steady income but less flexibility. Each declined opportunity represented a path not taken, a choice made to prioritize Lucy's needs over my own career advancement. I turned down a position as head alterations supervisor at Nordstrom because the hours would have conflicted with your school schedule. The salary was $60,000 a year with benefits. Mom, that's a huge amount of money. I make more than that now from my private business. But it took years to build the client base, and there was no guarantee of success. I chose the uncertain path because it allowed me to be available for you. I showed her appointment books from her elementary school years, filled with my handwriting, every doctor's appointment, every parent-teacher conference, every school play and soccer game. I rearranged my work schedule to be present for all of it. The books told the story of a mother who had made her daughter's needs the organizing principle of her professional life. Client appointments scheduled around school events, work deadlines adjusted to accommodate Lucy's activities, income lost to prioritize presence. You wrote in your essay that you were self-reliant, I said, gently, but look at this record, Lucy. Look at the structure I created to ensure you never had to be self-reliant, never had to worry about whether your needs would be met. Lucy was crying now, but quietly, as if the tears were coming from a place deeper than simple remorse. I never realized, you never realized, because I did my job well, because the point of all this work, all this planning, all this sacrifice, was to make sure you never had to experience the insecurity and uncertainty I faced. When I first came to America, I pulled out one final document, a letter I'd written to her on her first day of kindergarten but never given her. I wrote this 16 years ago, when you started school. I wanted you to know that whatever challenges you faced, whatever dreams you pursued, you would always have the security of knowing that someone was working to support your success. Lucy read the letter through her tears. It was written in my careful English, full of hopes and promises and unconditional love. It spoke of my dreams for her future, my commitment to her happiness, my determination to give her every advantage I'd never had. I kept my promises, I said quietly, every single one. I gave you security, opportunity, education, support. I gave you the confidence that comes from knowing you're unconditionally loved and consistently supported. Lucy looked up from the letter, her face streaked with tears. And I wrote an essay saying I did it all myself. You wrote an essay that ignored the foundation that made your achievements possible. You erased me from your story because acknowledging my contributions would have complicated the narrative you wanted to tell. The silence that followed was heavy with recognition. Lucy was finally seeing the true architecture of her life. Not the self-made success story she'd constructed, but the carefully built foundation of love, sacrifice, and strategic support that had made everything else possible. The next day, I did something I'd never done before. I invited Lucy to accompany me on client visits. I want you to see my work through other people's eyes, I told her, not through the filter of embarrassment or assumption, but through the eyes of people who value what I do. Our first stop was the boutique downtown where I'd been the exclusive alterations specialist for 8 years. The owner, Margaret Silva, greeted me with the warmth reserved for valued business partners. Grace, perfect timing. Mrs. Blackwell's gown came in this morning, and I told her you'd work your magic on the fit. Margaret turned to Lucy with genuine interest. You must be Lucy. Your mother talks about you constantly. We're all so proud of your Northwestern acceptance. Lucy glanced at me, surprised. She talks about me here. Constantly. Margaret laughed. Every achievement, every award, every milestone. Grace is the proudest mother I've ever met. And rightfully, so. You've accomplished amazing things. As we walked through the boutique, Margaret showed Lucy some of my recent work. Your mother saved this vintage Valentino. The previous owner had gained weight and thought it was ruined. Grace restructured the entire bodice without altering the designer's vision. It sold for $8,000. Lucy stared at the dress, running her fingers over seams that were invisible, alterations that looked like original construction. I had no idea clothes could be changed this much. Most people don't, Margaret said. That's why Grace is so valuable. She doesn't just alter clothes, she resurrects them, transforms them, sometimes completely reimagines them. Our next stop was Mrs. Patterson's house, a client who'd been coming to me for 12 years. Mrs. Patterson was in her 70s, a retired professor who'd built a wardrobe of quality pieces over decades. She answered the door with the smile she reserved for old friends. Grace, dear, and this must be Lucy. I've heard so much about you. Mrs. Patterson ushered us into her living room, where several garments were waiting for alteration. Your mother is an artist, you know, an absolute artist. She pulled out a letter from a stack on her coffee table. I was just writing to my daughter about Grace's work. Would you like to hear what I wrote? Without waiting for an answer, Mrs. Patterson began reading. My dear Sarah, you asked about the alterations woman I've mentioned. I must correct your terminology. Grace Kim is not merely an alterations woman. She is a master craftswoman whose understanding of garment construction borders on genius. Yesterday, she transformed a jacket I'd given up on into something that fits better than when I first bought it 30 years ago. Lucy listened with growing amazement as Mrs. Patterson continued. She doesn't just alter clothes, she improves them. She sees possibilities that the original designers missed. She has an engineer's precision and an artist's eye. You know she's an engineer, Mrs. Patterson added, looking at Lucy. Trained in Seoul, we've had wonderful conversations about the technical aspects of fabric construction. She's taught me more about textiles than I learned in all my years of buying clothes. Our final stop was the most revealing. Dr. Jennifer Chenyo, relation to my client. Mrs. Chenyo was a plastic surgeon who'd been coming to me for 5 years. She greeted us at her office, where she was between procedures. Grace, thank you for squeezing this in, Dr. Chen said, examining the lab coat I'd tailored for her. This is perfect. My colleagues are always asking where I get my coats altered. She turned to Lucy with professional interest. Are you planning to follow in your mother's footsteps? The fashion industry could use more people with her combination of technical skill and business acumen. I'm studying international business, Lucy said quietly. Excellent choice. Though I hope you've learned from your mother's example how to identify undervalued markets and build a premium service business. What Grace has accomplished is textbook entrepreneurship. Dr. Chen pulled out her phone, showing us photos of her recent wedding. Grace designed and created my reception dress from scratch. I gave her a vague idea of what I wanted, and she turned it into something beyond my imagination. The dress in the photos was stunning, elegant, and modern, with subtle details that showed hours of meticulous work. The fashion magazines wanted to know who designed it, Dr. Chen continued. I told them it was Grace Kim Couture. Several of their editors have contacted me for your information. As we drove home, Lucy was quiet, processing everything she'd seen and heard. Finally, she spoke. Dr. Chen called it Grace Kim Couture, like you're a fashion house. I am a fashion house, I said simply. A small one, but successful enough that I'm considering expansion. I've been offered space in the design district, downtown. You never told me any of this. You never asked. And when I tried to share my work with you, you seemed uncomfortable. I learned to keep my professional life separate from our family conversations. Lucy was quiet for several blocks. Then, Mrs. Patterson called you a master craftswoman. Dr. Chen called you an entrepreneur. Margaret treats you like a business partner, because that's what I am. The woman you described in your essay, limited education, minimal skills, simple aspirations. That person doesn't exist. She never existed. But you let me believe. I let you believe what you seemed determined to believe. Every time I tried to share my successes, you changed the subject. Every time I explained the complexity of my work, you gave polite but disinterested responses. Eventually, I stopped trying. We pulled into our driveway, but neither of us moved. To get out of the car, Lucy stared at our house, the house I'd bought with income from my embarrassing profession, with new eyes. All those people respect you, she said finally. They respect my work, my expertise, my professionalism. They see me as a skilled business owner who provides valuable services. They don't see me as someone to be embarrassed by or apologetic about. Lucy's voice was barely above a whisper. I'm the only one who sees you that way. Yes, I said gently. You are. That evening, I placed my diary on Lucy's desk, the same worn notebook where I'd recorded my thoughts and fears throughout her childhood. The pages were filled with hopes, worries, dreams, and reflections, written in a mixture of Korean and English, a private record of my journey as an immigrant mother. I want you to read this, I said, but only if you're ready to see me as a complete person, not just as your mother. Lucy picked up the diary reluctantly. Are you sure? This seems really personal. It is personal. That's exactly why you need to read it. You've reduced me to a simple narrative immigrant woman with limited options who worked hard to provide for her daughter. But I'm more complex than that. I've always been more complex than that. I sat in her desk chair while she settled on her bed with the diary. Start with the entry from March 15th, 2007, the day you were born. Lucy flipped through pages until she found the date. Her eyes widened as she read my handwriting, careful English mixed with flowing Korean characters, thoughts too complex for my developing language skills, emotions that required my mother tongue to express fully. You wrote in both languages. At Still think in Korean sometimes, especially when I'm feeling deeply about something. That entry I was trying to capture my feelings about becoming a mother in a foreign country, about the responsibility of raising a Korean American child. Lucy read silently, her expression growing more thoughtful with each page. The entry chronicled my fears about raising her alone, my determination to give her every advantage, my worry that she might grow up ashamed of her heritage. You were worried I'd be embarrassed by our culture, she said quietly. Even then, I could see how difficult it would be to maintain Korean identity in American society. I hoped I could teach you to be proud of both cultures, but I was realistic about the pressures you'd face. I pointed to a specific passage, read that part out loud. Lucy's voice was hesitant as she read. I want Lucy to succeed in America, but I don't want her to succeed at the cost of forgetting who she is. I hope I can teach her that being Korean American is not a burden to overcome but a gift that makes her stronger, more complete, more capable of understanding the world. Keep reading. The next few entries chronicle my early struggles with balancing work and motherhood. Lucy continued through pages that documented sleepless nights when she was colicky, my research into the best schools, my efforts to learn American parenting styles while maintaining Korean values. Entry after entry revealed a woman grappling with complex decisions, not the simple figure Lucy had imagined. You wrote about feeling isolated from other mothers because of language barriers, Lucy observed. I did feel isolated, but I also wrote about my determination to overcome that isolation. For your sake, read the entry from September 2009. Lucy found the page and read about my decision to join the PTA, despite my anxiety about speaking English in public. My preparation for meetings, my gradual building of relationships with other parents. You practiced conversations in advance, she said with surprise. For years. Every parent-teacher conference, every school event, every interaction with other families, I prepared for them like academic presentations. I researched topics, practiced pronunciations, anticipated questions. The entries painted a picture of extraordinary effort behind seemingly ordinary interactions. Lucy continued reading, her understanding deepening with each page. Harry, you wrote about my first day of kindergarten. You were worried I'd be teased for bringing Korean food in my lunch. You started asking for peanut butter sandwiches after that first week. I worried that you were already learning to hide parts of yourself to fit in. Lucy's voice grew smaller as she read, and here you wrote about being proud when I won the spelling bee, but also sad because I refused to teach the class any Korean words when the teacher asked. That was the beginning of a pattern. You started distancing yourself from anything that marked you as different. I told myself it was normal childhood development, but privately I worried I was losing you to assimilation. The diary entries became longer and more introspective as the years progressed. Lucy read about my business struggles, my financial fears, my pride in her achievements, my growing concern about the gap between us. This entry from last year, Lucy said, her voice thick with emotion. You wrote about feeling invisible in your own daughter's life. Read it aloud. Lucy's voice broke as she read. Lucy introduced me to her friend's mother today as just my mom, with the same tone she might use to say just the mailman. I understand she's developing her own identity, but I feel like I'm becoming less real to her every day. She sees me as a supporting character in her story rather than as a person, with my own dreams, struggles, and accomplishments. I wrote that after you deflected conversation about my work at your school's career day. You told me later that you were protecting me from questions that might be embarrassing, but what you were really protecting was your own image. Lucy set down the diary, tears streaming down her face. Mom, I had no idea you felt this way, because I hid it, because I thought protecting your feelings was more important than expressing my own, because I believed that good mothers sacrifice themselves completely for their children's comfort. I picked up the diary and flipped to the most recent entry, written just days after her graduation request. But this one I wrote after you asked me not to attend your graduation. Lucy's face crumpled as I read the entry aloud. Today, my daughter asked me to disappear from the most important day of her life because my presence would embarrass her. I realized that in trying to give her everything, I've taught her that I am nothing. In trying to ensure her success, I've made her ashamed of the person who made that success possible. The silence that followed was profound. Lucy sat with the diary in her lap, surrounded by 16 years of documented love, sacrifice, worry, and hope. I never wanted you to feel invisible, she whispered, but I do feel invisible. And worse, I've realized that I made myself invisible. I thought that was what love looked like, erasing myself so you could shine brighter. But all I taught you was that my dreams, my feelings, my dignity were less important than your comfort. Lucy looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. How do I fix this? How do I fix what I've done? By seeing me, I said simply, by acknowledging who I really am, instead of the limited version you've created in your mind. By understanding that respect isn't something I should have to earn from my own daughter, it's something I deserve simply by virtue of being the woman who loved you enough to sacrifice everything for your future. 3 days later, Lucy knocked on my sewing room door. I looked up from the wedding dress I was beading, intricate work that required complete concentration, and saw her holding a folded piece of paper. Mom, I wrote you something. Would you read it? I set down my needle and took the letter. Lucy's handwriting was careful, deliberate, as if each word had been chosen with the same precision I used when placing beads on silk. Dear Mom, I read aloud, wanting her to hear her own words. I've been thinking about everything you've shown me, everything you've taught me over the past few days. I realize that my entire understanding of our family, our story, and your sacrifices has been wrong. I paused, looking at Lucy. She was sitting on the edge of my work table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Keep reading, she said quietly. I wrote that college essay from a place of ignorance and selfishness. I created a narrative where I was the hero of my own success story, where I overcame obstacles through my own determination. But the truth is, you removed most of my obstacles before I ever encountered them. You didn't give me challenges to overcome, you gave me advantages that most people never have. The honesty in her words was unexpected and welcome. I continued reading. I realize now that when I described your work as just manual labor, I was revealing my own prejudices about what kinds of work have value. I absorbed societal messages about prestige and status without ever questioning whether those messages reflected reality. I let myself believe that intellectual work was inherently superior to skilled craftsmanship, that a college degree was more impressive than building a successful business from nothing. Lucy's voice was thick with emotion as she said, that part was the hardest to write. Admitting that I'd absorbed those prejudices. I am proud of you for recognizing them, I said gently. Many people never examine those assumptions. I returned to the letter. I also realized that my embarrassment about your accent was really embarrassment about my own identity. I thought that if I could distance myself from anything that marked us as foreign, I would be more accepted, more American. But in doing that, I rejected the part of myself that connects me to something larger than individual success. I rejected our family history, our cultural heritage, our shared experience as immigrants. This was deeper self-awareness than I'd expected from her. Lucy had always been intellectually gifted, but emotional intelligence was something different, something that required vulnerability and genuine self-reflection. The most painful realization, I continued reading, is that I asked you not to attend my graduation because I was ashamed of who you are, but you are someone extraordinary. You rebuilt your entire life in a foreign country. You mastered a new language and culture while maintaining your own identity. You turned your expertise into a thriving business. You raised a daughter as a single mother while pursuing your own professional success. Lucy was crying now, but quietly, as if she didn't want to interrupt the reading. I was ashamed of a woman who has every reason to be proud of herself. I was embarrassed by someone whose life is actually inspirational. I rejected the love and sacrifice of the person who made everything good in my life possible. I set the letter down and looked at Lucy directly. This is a beautiful letter. I can see that you've thought deeply about these issues. But, Lucy asked, clearly sensing that I had more to say. But words are easy, Lucy. Change is harder. Recognizing your mistakes is the first step, but it's only the first step. I picked up the beading needle again, needing something to do with my hands while I spoke. For 16 years, you've seen me in a particular way. For 16 years, I've allowed myself to become smaller and smaller in your eyes. Those patterns don't change overnight because of one conversation or one letter. Lucy was quiet for a moment. What would it take? What would I need to do to prove that I really understand, that I've really changed? It's not about proving anything to me, I said, threading a new bead onto my needle. It's about consistently treating me with the respect I deserve. Not because I've earned it through some special accomplishment, but because I'm your mother and I've dedicated my life to your well-being. I held up the beaded section of the dress I was working on. See this pattern? Each bead has to be placed individually, with attention and care. One beautiful bead doesn't make a pattern, you need hundreds of them, placed consistently, to create something meaningful. Respect is like that. One apology, one letter, one moment of recognition isn't enough. It has to be sustained, consistent, woven into the fabric of how we relate to each other. Lucy nodded slowly. I understand. I need to earn back your trust. You need to learn to see me clearly, I corrected. Not as the limited figure you created in your mind, not as a saint who sacrifices everything without expectation of recognition, but as a complete person who deserves to be valued for who she actually is. I set down my work and moved to sit next to her. Your apology is accepted, Lucy. I love you, and I forgive you. But our relationship needs to be rebuilt on a foundation of mutual respect and honest understanding. Will you come to graduation? She asked quietly. I smiled, the first genuine smile I'd felt in weeks. I'll be there, but not because you've given me permission to attend, because I have every right to be there. I'll be there as the woman who made your education possible, as someone who deserves to witness the success she helped create. Lucy hugged me then, tightly, and for the first time in years, it felt like she was embracing her real mother, not the diminished version she'd been tolerating. Graduation day arrived, warm and bright, perfect weather for the outdoor ceremony. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, adjusting the handbag I'd chosen to wear, the same deep blue, silk with silver embroidery that I'd worn to Lucy's kindergarten graduation. The fabric was beautiful, traditional, and unmistakably Korean. Lucy appeared in my doorway, already dressed in her cap and gown. She stopped when she saw me, her eyes widening with surprise and something that might have been concern. Mom, you're wearing the handbag. Yes, I am. I smoothed the skirt, checking that the ribbon was tied properly. Is that a problem? Lucy was quiet for a moment, and I could see her internal struggle. 3 weeks ago, she would have asked me to change into something less conspicuous, something that wouldn't mark us as different. But everything between us had shifted. No, she said finally. It's not a problem. It's beautiful. You look beautiful. Thank you. I picked up my purse and the small bouquet I'd prepared for her. Are you ready? We drove to the school in comfortable silence. Lucy seemed nervous, but it was the normal anxiety of a valedictorian, preparing to speak to hundreds of people, not the embarrassment about her mother that had characterized our recent interactions. As we walked toward the outdoor amphitheater, I noticed other families gathering, parents in their finest clothes, grandparents carrying flowers, siblings fidgeting in uncomfortable formal wear. Lucy and I found seats in the section reserved for families of honor students, and I felt a familiar pride as other parents congratulated her on her achievements. Lucy, your mother is stunning, Mrs. Patterson said, approaching our seats. She was the teacher who had known Lucy since elementary school, who had watched her grow from a shy kindergartner to a confident young woman. That dress is absolutely gorgeous. It's called a hanbok, Lucy said, and I heard something new in her voice, not embarrassment, but educational pride. It's traditional Korean formal wear. How wonderful that you're honoring your heritage today, Mrs. Patterson replied. What a perfect choice for such an important occasion. As the ceremony began, I watched Lucy take her place with the other graduates. She looked confident and poised, every inch the accomplished young woman I'd raised her to be. But I also saw something new, a quiet dignity that hadn't been there before, a sense of rootedness that came from finally understanding where her strength originated. When Principal Martinez introduced the valedictorian, Lucy walked to the podium with her head high. The speech she'd shown me weeks ago had been completely rewritten, and I waited with curiosity to hear what she would say. 4 years ago, Lucy began, her voice carrying clearly across the amphitheater. We walked into Lincoln High as children. Today, we leave as adults, ready to shape the future. But as we celebrate our achievements, I want to talk about something that's taken me too long to understand: the difference between individual success and supported success. I felt my breath catch. This was not the speech about overcoming obstacles through personal determination. I used to believe that I had succeeded through my own hard work and determination. I thought that acknowledging the help I'd received would somehow diminish my achievements. but I've learned that the opposite is true. Understanding the foundation that made my success possible actually makes me stronger, more grateful, and more motivated to honor those who invested in my future. Lucy's eyes found mine in the audience, and she smiled. My mother immigrated to America 25 years ago with engineering expertise, entrepreneurial vision, and the determination to build a better life for her family. She didn't just support my education, she strategically planned every aspect of it. She didn't just encourage my dreams, she worked extra hours to fund them. She didn't just love me, she transformed that love into opportunities I could never have created for myself. The audience was silent, completely engaged with Lucy's words. I felt tears gathering in my eyes as she continued. I stand here today, not as someone who overcame disadvantages, but as someone who was given extraordinary advantages by a woman who sacrificed her own comfort to ensure mine. My mother rebuilt her career in a foreign country, mastered a new language and culture, and created a successful business all while raising me as a single parent. Lucy paused, her voice growing stronger. Class of 2023, as we leave here today, I challenge us to remember that our achievements are not just personal victories, they're the culmination of countless acts of love, sacrifice, and support from people who believed in our potential before we could see it ourselves. To the parents, grandparents, teachers, and mentors in our audience, thank you for the foundation you've provided. To my fellow graduates, let's honor that foundation by using our education, our opportunities, and our privileges to build a world worthy of the sacrifices that made our success possible. Lucy concluded with the phrase in Korean, her pronunciation careful but confident. Thank you, Mom. I love you. The applause was thunderous. I was crying openly now, overwhelmed by pride and love, and the recognition that my daughter had finally, truly seen me. After the ceremony, as families gathered for photos and congratulations, Lucy found me in the crowd. She was still wearing her cap and gown, her valedictorian medal, catching the afternoon sun. Mom, she said, taking my hands. I meant every word. I know you did, I replied. I'm so proud of you, not just for your grades or your achievements, but for your courage to tell the truth. As we posed for photos with her friends and their families, I noticed how differently Lucy introduced me. This is my mother, Grace Kim. She owns Grace Kim Couture Alterations. She's an entrepreneur and an engineer, and the person who made everything possible for me. The hanbok I wore wasn't a costume or a cultural statement, it was simply the beautiful, formal dress of a proud mother attending her daughter's graduation. And for the first time in years, I felt completely comfortable in my own skin, in my own story, in my rightful place at my daughter's side. 2 months later, I was hanging a new family photo in our hallway when Lucy returned from her summer job at the Korean Cultural Center. The picture had been taken at graduation, showing both of us smiling, genuinely me in my hanbok, her in cap and gown, both of us looking like we belonged exactly where we were. How was work today? I asked as she set down her bag. Amazing. I helped translate for a new family that just arrived from Seoul. The kids were so scared about starting school in America, but when I told them about my mom's story, about how you built a successful business here, they seemed so much more hopeful. Lucy had taken the job at the Cultural Center on her own initiative, wanting to learn more about Korean American experiences, to understand the broader context of our family's story. The shy teenager who once avoided Korean cultural events had become someone eager to help other immigrant families navigate American systems. Mrs. Park asked if you might be willing to speak at our next workshop. Lucy continued. They want successful Korean American business owners to share their experiences with new arrivals. I would be honored, I said, meaning it completely. The idea of sharing my story publicly, of being seen as a role model, still felt new and wonderful. Lucy sat down at the kitchen table where I was reviewing invoices for the month. Business had been better than ever since word spread about my work through Dr. Chen's fashion magazine contacts. I was booked 3 months in advance and had started turning down projects, a luxury I'd never allowed myself before. Can I help with anything? Lucy asked, gesturing to the paperwork. Actually, yes. I've been thinking about expanding the business, maybe hiring an assistant. Would you help me draft a job posting? Lucy's face lit up. Of course. What kind of qualifications are you looking for? As we worked together on the posting, I was struck by how naturally we'd found this new rhythm. Lucy asked thoughtful questions about my business operations, offered suggestions based on her economics coursework, showed genuine interest in my professional challenges and goals. You know, she said as we finished the draft, I've been thinking about adding a Korean language minor to my business degree, and maybe taking some fashion merchandising classes as electives. That sounds wonderful, but do it because you're interested, not because you think it will please me. I am interested. For the first time, I'm actually curious about the intersection of business and culture, about how heritage can be a professional asset rather than something to overcome. Lucy paused, organizing the invoices into neat stacks. I've also been thinking about that Northwestern essay. The admissions counselor said I could submit a revised personal statement for their alumni magazine. Something about how my perspective has evolved since starting college. What would you write about? About learning to see my mother clearly. About understanding that privilege isn't just about money or social status. It's about having someone who believes in your potential enough to sacrifice everything for it. About realizing that my success story isn't complete without acknowledging the foundation it was built on. I smiled, touched by her thoughtfulness. That sounds like an important story to tell. I want other students to understand what I didn't. Being proud of your family, your heritage, your community isn't something that holds you back. It's something that makes you stronger. As evening approached, we cooked dinner together. Korean-American fusion that reflected both of our tastes. Lucy practiced her Korean pronunciation while I taught her to make kimchi jjigae, and we switched naturally between languages as we worked. Mom, Lucy said as we sat down to eat, I have something to tell you. I looked up, hearing the seriousness in her voice. Northwestern has a study abroad program in Seoul. I applied for next semester. I set down my chopsticks, surprised, really. I want to meet our family there. I want to see where you grew up, understand the culture you came from. I want to learn the stories you tried to teach me when I was too stubborn to listen. The idea of Lucy connecting with her Korean relatives, of walking the streets where I'd played as a child, of experiencing the culture she'd spent years rejecting, filled me with unexpected emotion. I think that's wonderful, I said. I'll write to my sister, prepare them for your visits. Would you maybe come with me? At least for part of the trip. I considered the question. 6 months ago, the idea of returning to Korea would have seemed impossible, too expensive, too complicated, too disruptive to my business. But my expanded client base, my raised prices, my new sense of my own worth had changed what felt possible. Yes, I said, I think it's time for both of us to go home. Lucy reached across the table and took my hand. Thank you for everything. For the sacrifices I didn't understand, for the patience you showed while I figured things out, for never giving up on me even when I gave up on us. You're my daughter, I said simply. Loving you, supporting you, believing in you, that's not something I do conditionally. But having you finally see me, finally understand what we've built together, that's a gift I didn't know I needed. As we cleared the dishes together, I thought about the woman I'd been 6 months ago, quiet, accommodating, slowly disappearing into the background of my own daughter's life. That woman had believed that love meant sacrifice without recognition, support without acknowledgement, presence without voice. But the woman I was now understood something different, that love without boundaries isn't sustainable, that respect isn't optional even within families, that dignity is something you must insist upon, not something you wait for others to grant you. The new family photo on the wall showed 2 women who belonged to each other completely, not because one had erased herself for the other, but because both had learned to see each other clearly, honestly, with the full complexity that real love requires. Lucy was heading to Northwestern in the fall, then to Seoul in the spring, then into whatever future her talents and opportunities would create. But she was going as someone who understood where her strength came from, someone who carried her heritage as a source of pride rather than shame. Someone who knew that her mother's love was not a limitation to overcome but a foundation to build upon. And I was staying here, in the life I'd built through 25 years of determination and sacrifice. But no longer as someone who existed only in service to others. I was here as Grace Kim, engineer, entrepreneur, artist, mother, a woman whose story was worth telling, whose accomplishments deserved recognition, whose voice had something valuable to say. The lesson Lucy had learned about Sham, that not something that comes from who you are, but from forgetting who you are, had become a lesson for both of us. And in teaching her to remember, I had finally remembered myself.